Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. Jake was a man of solitude, an avid hiker and adventurer. He found solace in the untamed wilderness. His latest destination was a remote canyon in the Utah wilderness, a place whispered about by locals for its eerie history. Stories of strange sightings and unsettling occurrences swirled around the area, but Jake brushed them off as folklore. He wasn't one to scare easily, or so he thought. The trek began uneventfully. Jake parked his truck at the trailhead, loaded his gear, and set off into the canyon. The first 2 days were breathtaking. Towering red rock walls, winding trails, and the occasional sighting of wildlife made for an ideal adventure. Jake kept a journal, jotting down observations about the scenery and sketching the landscapes. Nights were calm, with the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. But on the third night, things took a dark turn. Jake had set up camp in a secluded clearing surrounded by jagged rocks. After a dinner of dehydrated soup and crackers, he climbed into a sleeping bag, letting the warmth of the fire lull him to sleep. The night was still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, almost oppressive. Somewhere past midnight, a sound woke him. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel outside his tent. Jake froze. He lay still, ears straining, his heart pounding against his ribcage. At first, he thought it might be a bear or some other large animal, but the steps were too calculated, too human. Gathering his courage, he reached for his flashlight and flicked it on, casting a beam of light onto the thin walls of his tent. Shadows danced, but nothing stood out. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a few minutes, Jake convinced himself it was just his imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered by, startled by the light. He took a deep breath and settled back into his sleeping bag. Then he heard it again. This time, the steps were closer, circling the tent. Gravel crunched beneath deliberate, slow movements. Jake's mouth went dry. He sat up, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Summoning his nerve, he unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on something that made his blood run cold. It stood about 20 feet away, partially obscured by a boulder. At first glance, it looked like a coyote, lean and wiry, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, almost human-like. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the creature turned its head toward him. Its eyes glowed like embers, burning with an unnatural light. Then it did something that made every hair on his body stand on end. It opened its mouth, and a voice, his voice, echoed across the clearing. Jake. The word was distorted, a grotesque mockery of human speech. Jake's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, locked in a primal fear. The creature took a step closer, its long limbs bending unnaturally, and repeated his name. Jakey. That was enough to snap him out of his paralysis. Jake scrambled out of the tent, leaving everything behind. He ran blindly into the night, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The terrain was unforgiving, but adrenaline drove him forward. Behind him, he heard the crunch of gravel and the creature's guttural mimicry of his name. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, parked miles away. He dove inside, locked the doors, and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. When he finally reached civilization, he checked into a motel and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of those glowing eyes. Weeks passed. Jake tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. The experience haunted him, creeping into his dreams and turning them into nightmares. Months later, as winter set in, Jake returned home from work to find something waiting for him. On his front porch, neatly stacked, were his camping supplies. The tent, his backpack, even the flashlight he'd dropped in his haste to escape. At first, he thought someone had found his abandoned gear and returned it. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something chilling. The tent fabric was marred by deep claw marks, slashes that couldn't have been made by any ordinary animal. And etched into the metal casing of the flashlight was a single word, Jakey. Jake's hands trembled as he gathered the items and brought them inside. He burned sage, locked his doors, and sat up all night, shotgun in hand. He never ventured into the wilderness again. But sometimes, late at night, he hears it. Faint footsteps outside his window and a voice, distorted and mocking, calling his name. Story 2. The Shape in the Rear View. Sarah had always loved the open road, the quiet freedom, the long stretches of highway that felt like they belonged to no one but her. But tonight, driving through the desolate, empty roads of the Navajo Nation, something was different. The night felt oppressive, as though the air itself was thick with something unspoken, something waiting. It was a little after midnight when she began to notice the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of trees in the wind. Just an eerie, unnerving stillness. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and tried to shake the feeling, but the unease only grew. The headlights of her car cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the rough road ahead of her. But in the distance, she noticed something moving. A figure, no, a person, standing off to the side, near the edge of the road. It was strange. The figure stood perfectly still, as though waiting for something. She had been driving for hours, and the fatigue from the long journey was beginning to set in. Maybe it was just another hitchhiker, though she hadn't seen a soul for miles. Maybe someone in need of a ride, or maybe just a lonely traveler. Her car slowed as she considered stopping, but as she drew closer, her heart began to race. The figure did not move. It remained still, watching her approach. It was far too quiet, too still. And then the headlights of her car finally illuminated the figure, and her blood ran cold. What she saw was not a person at all. It stood upright, but its body was elongated and twisted, as if it were built for something much darker than a human form. The limbs were too long, the joints too crooked, and it had a strange, unnatural movement. Its body was that of a man, but its head was not human. It was the head of a deer, massive antlers stretching upward into the night, sharp and grotesque, dripping a thick, tar-like substance that splattered onto the dirt beneath it. The creature's eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel as if it could see straight into her soul. The air around her felt colder, heavier, and she froze. Panic hit her like a tidal wave. Her breath caught in her throat. She slammed her foot onto the gas pedal, her tires screeching as the car lurched forward, and she tore down the road without looking back. But the thing, whatever it was, didn't stay behind. In the rearview mirror, she could see it. It wasn't just standing still anymore. No, it was chasing her, running on all fours with terrifying speed, its body shifting, twisting as it sprinted like an animal. No, like something far more inhuman. The antlers bobbed up and down with each bound, the tar-like substance dripping from them in dark, sickening trails. Her heart hammered in her chest as she pushed the car faster, weaving through the winding, empty road, trying to distance herself from the nightmare that followed. But the creature was keeping pace. She could see it clearly in the mirror now, the way its legs stretched unnaturally as it raced behind her, its head twisting at impossible angles, its eerie, glowing eyes locked on her through the glass. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal she'd ever seen. It was something older, something that shouldn't exist in this world. A sudden jolt of terror hit her, and she knew that it was gaining on her. The creature wasn't just following, it was hunting. Her palms were sweaty, her fingers numb from gripping the wheel, but she didn't dare stop. The headlights blurred as her speed increased, the engine roaring like a wild beast in its own right, but nothing would shake the creature behind her. The next few miles were a blur of lights, darkness, and dread. Every time she glanced into the rearview mirror, the creature was there, always a few feet closer, its eerie form growing more and more monstrous the longer she looked at it. She could feel its presence like a shadow looming over her, suffocating her with its unnatural malice. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of pure terror, she saw the distant glow of a gas station in the distance, a beacon of safety, a sign of life. Her hands trembled as she pushed the pedal to the floor, her car speeding toward the lights, toward the haven of human civilization. As she pulled into the parking lot, she slammed the car into park, barely registering the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. She didn't wait to turn off the engine. She threw open the door and sprinted inside the small station, her heart still pounding in her chest. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as she entered, but his eyes widened when he saw her wild, panicked expression. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked, though his tone was more cautious than concerned. There was something out there," she stammered, gasping for air. "It was following me. A creature, like a man with the head of a deer. It..." The clerk's expression shifted. He looked past her, as if expecting something, as if he had heard this before. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "The Skinwalker." Sarah blinked, trying to process the words. Skinwalker. The term felt foreign, out of place. The clerk nodded, leaning in closer. "It's an old Navajo legend. A shapeshifter, a witch, a curse. They take the form of animals, sometimes people, and hunt their prey." He paused for a moment, eyeing the door as though he expected the creature to walk in behind her. "It's not something you want to mess with. If you've seen one, you're marked. You need to cleanse yourself. Burn sage. or you might find yourself followed for a long time. The weight of his words settled heavily over her, but all she could think about was the creature's eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that never left her, even as she had fled. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fear still choking her throat. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. "I can give you some sage," he said. "Burn it as soon as you get home. Do it right away. And don't look back. Not even once." Sarah nodded numbly, still shaking. The terror she felt was far from over. The memory of the creature's gaze would haunt her long after she left the gas station, and she couldn't help but wonder if it had truly stopped chasing her, or if it was waiting for her to make the wrong move. But one thing was certain: she would never drive through the Navajo Nation again. Not without wondering whether the shape she saw in the rear view would be the last thing she ever saw. And if she ever looked back, would it be there, still chasing her, just out of reach, forever? Story 3. The Farmstead Curse. Ethan had always known he would inherit the ranch. It had been his grandfather's pride and joy for decades. An old, weathered farmhouse surrounded by miles of wide-open desert, deep in the heart of New Mexico. He spent summers there as a child, helping his grandfather feed the animals, fix the fences, and listen to the old man's stories about the land. Stories that, over time, had started to sound less like tales and more like warnings. But when the call came, telling Ethan the ranch was his, he didn't hesitate. He had longed to leave the city life behind and escape to the quiet isolation of the farm. At least, that's what he thought at first. The first few days were nothing out of the ordinary. The air was thick with desert heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made the stillness of the land feel even more suffocating. Ethan moved into the farmhouse and spent his days fixing things around the property, checking on the livestock, and getting reacquainted with the rhythms of country life. But there were things that started to feel off. It was the bones. Every morning, as he made his way out to the barn to check on the horses, he would notice them. Small, animal bones scattered across the ground. Rib cages, skulls, femurs, arranged in strange, almost deliberate patterns. At first, Ethan assumed the animals had been scavenged by predators, but something about the arrangement didn't sit right with him. It was as if the bones were trying to communicate something, or perhaps they were meant to send a message. Ethan tried to ignore it. He chalked it up to the land's harshness. Animals that wandered too far from the barn often became prey to coyotes or bobcats, and the ranch had seen its share of loss over the years. But then livestock started disappearing. It was subtle at first, just one sheep here, a goat there, but soon it became impossible to ignore. His chickens, which had always been lively and numerous, began to vanish in the night. Every morning, he would find their empty coops, the air thick with the smell of feathers and blood, but no sign of what had taken them. That's when the whispers began. It was always at night, just after the sun dipped behind the hills, when the winds would pick up, howling through the trees. At first, Ethan thought it was just the wind, the way it sometimes carried sounds across the land. But soon, he began to hear distinct voices, low and guttural, carried on the wind. They sounded like murmurs at the edge of his hearing, too faint to understand, but just loud enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. "Don't go outside," his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. He had said that when Ethan was younger, but it didn't make sense then. Now, it felt like a warning from beyond the grave. One evening, just as the sun set and the chill of night began to creep across the land, Ethan decided to take a walk through the fields. He had been cooped up inside for too long, and he needed the fresh air. The wind was stronger than usual, carrying that eerie whisper he had come to dread. His dogs, usually so eager to run at his heels, were huddled together by the door, their eyes wide with fear. They wouldn't go outside. Ethan shrugged it off. Maybe they were just spooked by the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It wasn't uncommon for the desert to throw an unexpected thunderstorm. But as he walked further out, the hairs on his neck began to stand up. Something wasn't right. At first he saw nothing, just the flickering shadows cast by the last rays of sunlight, stretching long across the dusty earth. But then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The shape was large, and its movements were jerky and unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing terribly. Its body was hunched low, almost crawling, but it moved on two legs, swaying in the wind. Ethan's heart pounded as he stood frozen, unsure of whether to call out or run. Then it turned. The thing's face, if you could even call it a face, was twisted in a grotesque mockery of human features. Its eyes were dark, sunken, and gleaming with an unnatural hunger. And then it opened its mouth. A howl. It was like nothing Ethan had ever heard before. A sound that seemed to tear through the night air, mixing with the wind, echoing across the empty fields. Ethan's stomach turned, and he felt a wave of pure terror crash over him. He tried to call for his dogs, but they wouldn't move. They were huddled against the wall of the house, trembling, their eyes wide with fear. The figure, still a blur in the distance, howled again, its voice raw and filled with malice. Ethan felt a cold chill wash over him, as if the air around him had suddenly dropped to freezing temperatures. His legs felt heavy, his breath shallow. The wind screamed, the whispers now louder, more insistent, almost like a chant. Leave. It was a voice, low and guttural, but unmistakably human. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the voice echoed from the empty fields, filling the air with an oppressive sense of doom. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the land. Something wanted him gone. He didn't wait for a second warning. He turned and ran back to the house, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. The next morning, as he stumbled out of bed, still shaking from the night's events, he saw it. Claw marks. Deep, jagged gouges, some of them as long as his arm, scratched into the wood of the front door. They were fresh, oozing something dark and viscous, like blood, but not quite. Ethan knew, in that instant, that it wasn't just a wild animal. This was something else, something far older, far more dangerous, something that lived in the land itself, waiting for the unwary. That evening, he made the decision. He couldn't stay. He didn't care about the ranch. He didn't care about the inheritance. The land was cursed, tainted by whatever dark force had been lurking there for generations. His grandfather had known it, and he had tried to warn Ethan. The house, the animals, the land. All of it was under the thrall of the Skinwalker, and there was no escaping it. Ethan sold the ranch, packing his things in a hurry, leaving the land behind for good. But as he drove away, he could have sworn he saw something watching him from the edge of the fields. A figure, standing tall and still, with glowing eyes fixed on him. The whispers followed him as he left, carried on the wind. And when he closed his eyes that night, he heard the same words echoing in the darkness. Leave. But this time it was too late.